Welcome back to another episode of the Mainly Hoops podcast. Back with another Big Ten team preview here. We've got the Maryland Terrapins under first-year head coach Buzz Williams coming over from Texas A&M. Before we do dive into their outlook, if you have been enjoying our off-season content, please go ahead and like and subscribe. But now taking a look at the Maryland offense first here, Cody, what strengths do you see on this side of the ball?
Yeah, and there's one pretty obvious strength with this team, as it kind of has been in recent years with Buzz Williams teams, and it's getting on the offensive glass. They were top 70 nationally in all 6 years at Texas A&M, including the number one mark in the nation each of the last 2 seasons, and they retained a lot of their pieces from Texas A&M. He brought them over from there, to bring them to the Big Ten. Pharrell Payne, who had a 13.6% offensive rebound rate, and Solomon Washington, who had a 10.7% offensive rebound rate. Well, that will allow for a solid unit in itself. But, Buzz Williams also went out and added a guy in Colin Metcalf coming from Northeastern, and then a guy like Elijah Saunders, who I think can help out in this area as well. The numbers aren't fantastic with him, but I think when it's more of an emphasis, I think that is going to be a strength of his, and it's going to be a strength of this roster, obviously. It's a group they're also going to get to the free throw line at a super high clip. It's just an aggressive mentality, and our super physical front court's going to help. Pharrell Payne's going to be the leader of that. They started to use him a decent amount in post-up actions last year, particularly when Wade Taylor, missed some time with injury. That he's going to be a guy that's going to be asked to do a little bit more than your typical Buzz Williams big man. They're going to throw it down to him on the low block and ask him to play a little bully ball there. And I think he's going to be able to do that to an extent. And then one final note is I think this is an improved shooting team, as a whole compared to past Texas A&M teams, or at least the past couple of years that have kind of, just been engraved in my mind whenever I watch those games. They're out there playing volleyball, basically. You throw it at the backboard and, hopefully you go up there and grab it. But, I think this team's going to look a little bit different. It's going to be the same type of style, but I think this team shoots it a little bit better. Like the last 2 seasons at Texas A&M, they were 328th and 342nd in three-point shooting efficiency. But, I just think this roster has a little bit more upside with guys like Isaiah Watts and, Miles Rice coming in as well, which is probably going to be the starting backcourt. And then, Darius Adams, the freshman, who's probably going to come in. I don't know if he'll start right away or if he'll be like their 6th man, but he's a very perimeter-oriented guy who can play the 2 or the 3. He's a little bit thin frame, so I'm not really sure what the defensive fit's going to look like. But when he's in the game, he's going to be able to knock down shots and catch and shoot a little bit on the move as well. So it's just a different dimension than past Buzz Williams teams have had. And then, a couple bench pieces like David Coit, coming off the bench. He's a shooter with some range, and Elijah Saunders playing the 4, I think is going to add somewhat of a floor spacing element. So I think it's a little bit more of a well-rounded offense. I don't think it has necessarily like the star power or just any sort of like a creator like Wade Taylor. But I think by committee, I think this is a better shooting team.
Yeah, I mean, my thought was this, obviously the offensive rebounding attack is going to be really strong. I think it's a better shooting team, like you said, than Buzz Williams typically has. I still don't think it's like any high-level shooting team, right? Like for me, it's just like the shots these guys are taking, in particular, like Miles Rice, doesn't take a lot of very good shots. Which leads to him having a pretty poor effective field goal percentage, a career 47.3% effective field goal percentage, last year 46.1. And then, I mean, if you look at him in his last 2 years, in 16 games last year, top 50 games, 37.1% effective field goal percentage. And then the year before that, 11 top 50 games, 43.5%, 43.5% effective field goal percentage, down from his 48 for the season. So especially when it seems like he's either playing stronger competition or when more falls on his plate, his efficiency gets worse, which I think is a little bit of a problem here because like this perimeter group isn't exactly like fantastic here at Maryland. Like you mentioned, Darius Adams, I think, has some intrigue on the offensive end. He's going to be able to knock down shots, it looks like, but I'm a little bit worried about the just the overall efficiency of this perimeter group. Obviously, you can kind of make up for that with the offensive rebounding attack that they're going to have, like Buzz Williams teams usually do. Last year, what were they? They were in like the 270s, I think, in 2-point field goal percentage, and they were 328th in 3-point field goal percentage at Texas A&M. So, I mean, you can make up for it in other areas, but I do think that it is a little bit of an issue. I'm also not in love with like the primary creation guys here. Miles Rice being one of those guys, 18% assist rate to a 21% turnover rate. Darius Adams, I don't really know what he's going to look like. I think he may be more off ball, at least to start. You've got Isaiah Watts, who's, not a strong creator, career 11% assist rate. David Coit has always been kind of an off the bench, or at least his year at Kansas, he was. So I don't really love this perimeter group in terms of efficiency and creation. There's really no like go-to scorer on the wings either. I think like maybe Darius Adams could end up being something of that on the perimeter, but I don't really see like a perimeter option where you're throwing them the ball like Buzz Williams teams have traditionally had in Wade Taylor the last few years to say, hey, go get us a bucket. Even though Wade Taylor might have gone like 7 for 23, he's going to get you to the line, and he's going to make some big shots. For as much as I've hated on Wade Taylor over the years, he does hit some pretty big shots. And I don't really see that on this team.
Yeah, I mean, with the Wade Taylor stuff, I'm more in the camp that he had to take a lot of those shots because nobody else could even create those shots. He obviously was a bit erratic and he took some shots that he shouldn't have taken, but overall, like a lot of the looks that he took it was just something that he had to take late in the shot clock. He took some early in the clock too, but still, I just think, and this is like Buzz Williams. I think he understands that his teams aren't going to be efficient from the floor. Like he's emphasizing other areas. Like he's trying to get all over the glass. He's trying to win in the extras category. I mean, and a big part of the extras is taking care of the ball. Obviously, his teams have struggled there a little bit, and I think they're probably going to struggle this year. You mentioned it with the Rice and Watts backcourt. I'm personally not a fan of this backcourt as a whole. Like, how I feel about Miles Rice. I'm not overly high on him, and I thought he was pretty overhyped on that run a couple of years ago with Washington State. I think he finished that year at Washington State. He missed like his last like 34 threes or something like that. I don't have the exact number, but he went on a super cold streak. And when his shot's not falling, like he just doesn't look like a very good player. And he's probably not a power conference point guard. I think he is, but when he's playing like that, there's really not a ton of value he brings to the table because he's really not that high level of an advantage creator. And, kind of the same with Watts and even Adams. I don't think Adams is a guy that's going to be creating any offense here. He's very perimeter reliant, like super thin frame, struggles to score at the rim. And there's not going to be a ton of driving lanes anyway with like the lack of front court floor spacing as a whole. Like I think Saunders brings some of that element, but as a whole, I think the front court floor spacing is going to be so poor that these guys aren't going to be able to get to the rim off the bounce. And I don't really trust them to do it all that much. But most of the points I agree with you with. I think this is an improved shooting team, but it's not so improved that it's going to completely flip the narrative on what a Buzz Williams offense looks like.
No, for sure. Now looking at the defensive side of the ball, you've got like, as you mentioned, Pharrell Payne up front, who last year had a 7% block rate at Texas A&M. So now, you have his presence back, especially as a guy that doesn't really foul a lot. And his average played about half a game last year and only averaged 2 fouls a game. So definitely a strong point there. But, other strengths you want to add to that? What do you see in this Maryland defensive attack?
Yeah, I mean, I thought Pharrell Payne was a great ad for Texas A&M last year. I kind of went to bat for him in the preseason. I think getting him to come over here is huge. He's big for the rim protection. He's massive for the defensive rebounding element. Um, and then you bring Solomon Washington over, who is a massive piece on the wing for that A&M defense and has been for a few years now. And that's just kind of the theme with this defense: its length, athleticism, and its physicality. It's very similar to the offensive side where they kind of want to bully you, and it leads to a higher foul rate as a whole. But I do think this is a defense that wins out over time with their length and athleticism. And you bring over another guy, and like I mentioned, Colin Metcalf for his offensive rebounding. He's a really good rim protector. He had a 12% block rate last season at Northeastern. I don't know if it turns into 12% in the Big Ten, but he does have plus length. He probably has a +4 or 5 wingspan, if I had to guess. I mean, he plays much bigger than his 6'9" frame. And then, the wing pieces are solid as well. I don't think it's the same as, past Texas A&M defenses or anything like that. I think this roster on the perimeter is a bit worse, but I like Rice and Watts as like fits in this scheme. I would consider them to be plus defenders and a plus fit here. It's just not exactly the same as past A&M teams, but it's a group they're gonna force turnovers at a high level with the scheme. They deny the rim, they deny the paint at a high level, and the 2-point defense is going to be a real strength for them again as well. Probably not the same again as Texas A&M defenses in the past. They were 12th in adjusted efficiency last year, but I do think they have very similar qualities to be, completely fine in this area. Buzz Williams defense is top 65 in turnover rate and in 5 of 6 seasons at A&M, and their 2-point defense finished inside the top 30 last year, and they retained a lot of the key pieces. So I think it's going to look fairly similar.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, there's a lot of strong points, and I think bringing over, like you mentioned, Washington and Payne from A&M to kind of at least jumpstart this defense in the Buzz Williams way is certainly going to help. I have some issues on this side of the ball, primarily with depth. At the guard spot, I have some concerns, particularly like, Darius Adams. I think he can be a plus on the offensive end. I don't really know what he can be on this end. You mentioned earlier, thinner framed guy, freshman, not really sure what his defensive outlook is going to look like. I don't really forecast him to be an overly strong defender in a Buzz Williams type system. Another guy, David Coit, who, he's 5'11". They're going to need him at times for offense, but I don't really love him as a defender. He hasn't really been much of a defender at any of his stops he's been at. He's undersized, doesn't really provide a ton on this end, especially from like a switchability, versatility standpoint that you typically need in a Buzz Williams defense. And then, also in the front court, you mentioned Colin Metcalf. He's obviously a nice addition. I do have some concerns with the overall like front court depth. I think having a guy like Elijah Saunders definitely helps to like bridge that. He's not a fantastic defender though. He's solid on the defensive glass, but he doesn't really provide much from like a rim protection standpoint. As like a weak side rim protector to kind of help these guys out. Pharrell Payne has never played really over half a game. So you're going to probably ask him to play a good chunk more. Fortunately, like I mentioned earlier, he's not one to get into foul trouble typically. Colin Metcalf, however, is like he's a career 5.7 fouls per 40 guy. So I don't really know. Like maybe their split is more like 28-12 or 26-14. I don't know how they're exactly going to do it. But I think like I just have some concerns about the depth, and I don't really know also like how fantastic this team will be on the defensive glass. Pharrell Payne, for as good as he is on the offensive glass, like only a 14% defensive rebound rate last year. Solomon Washington doesn't provide a ton on the defensive glass, 14% defensive rebound rate. That A&M team last year was was 84th in defensive rebound rate as a team. So I don't really think this is going to be a strong point on this roster. I don't necessarily think it's going to be like a crazy weakness, but I could definitely see them not being super strong in that area.
Yeah, and in this scheme, I don't really think it's possible to be within the top 50 in defensive rebound rate anyway. There's a lot of guys scrambling around, and it's just tough to be in rebound position in that aspect. But yeah, I think that's what kind of brings down Pharrell Payne's defensive rebound numbers. I think he was playing in a more passive scheme. I think he'd be like a glass cleaner. I think he'd be a 25% defensive rebound rate guy, but it's just like not. The scheme just doesn't fit him well in that regard. I think he's a great rim protector and does a lot of things well, but it's just not going to look great from a defensive rebounding aspect. But the one issue that I guess I have will be it's guarding the 3-point line. If there's going to be less athleticism on the perimeter on this roster for a team that gives up a lot of catch and shoot opportunities, they don't really have the greatest recovery defenders or the greatest length out there to be able to defend those consistently. They last season when they had like fantastic wing defenders, they were 350th in 3-point rate allowed, and they were 145th in percentage allowed. And they had guys like, Zurich Phelps was a great defender, Jace Carter, Manny Obaseki was a guy that fit. I think, if they would have had Riquise Passmore on this roster this year, he's out for the year with a torn Achilles. I think he would have been a really nice defensive piece here. But, if A&M's defense with that roster was going to be 145th in 3-point percentage allowed and gave up as many unguarded threes as they gave up, I think it's fair to say that they're going to be a little bit worse. That's my main issue with this team. I think the depth I'm a little bit higher on some of the depth pieces. I think there are some guys down the board that can play a role, like Andre Mills, who redshirted, George Turkson, who redshirted and came over from A&M. And I think that Court's not switchable and probably not like a great fit, but I actually think he plays with a bunch of intensity and is a guy that can, get after you on this end. He proved that to be like a pretty good on-ball defender at Kansas. Obviously, his ceiling on the side is kind of capped, but I actually was kind of impressed from what I saw. So I think it's a fine depth piece, but yeah, overall, it's just a little bit lacking compared to the A&M team last year and in pretty much every area.
Yeah. I was actually going to mention, before we jump to MVP and X Factor, I was going to mention Passmore. I think he could have been kind of like an X Factor in some ways for this team, as a guy that was a former 4-star recruit to Kansas. And now, of course, tore his Achilles, so he's got a long road back. But I think he could have been a nice piece for this team. But obviously, we're going to have to wait another year to see, and who knows if it will be even at Maryland. So shifting gears now, as I was saying, to MVP and X Factor, where'd you go here?
Yeah, I went with Pharrell Payne as my MVP. I think he's going to have a lot more offensive responsibility than he had last year. Like I mentioned, I think he's going to be used more frequently in post up, and it's just kind of the fact that they don't have like a high volume perimeter shot maker and like a Wade Taylor on this roster. Like there's potential for it to be Darius Adams, and it's probably not going to be Miles Rice. He's more of like an interior, like mid-range reliant guy, and we don't love Watts as an advantage creator, really. So I think Payne's going to take on a lot of responsibility, potentially get up to 14, 15 points per game. I don't think there's anybody that's going to wow you on the offensive side on this roster, but I think he's probably the one who's most in line to do so. My X Factor, I went with Elijah Saunders. I think he's going to be really important at the 4 position from a floor spacing perspective, and I think he can unlock a few more things for this offense as a whole. Obviously, like I don't love him defensively in this scheme, in this setup, but I do think what he brings to the offensive side can help unlock some things.
Yeah, it's definitely fair. He should be very important, particularly on the offensive end. For me, I went with Pharrell Payne as well as MVP. I think he's going to be very important to their offensive attack, to their offensive rebounding, of course, to the rim protection. I think he's just, to me, by far their most important player. X Factor, I went with Darius Adams. I think, with the guard group, the efficiency being a little bit lacking, in the guard group. Bringing in a guy who, in some places, I think closed as a 5-star, coming in to Maryland. I think the upsides there as an offensive shot maker, and maybe a little bit more that we haven't really seen. So if he can provide some of that for this offense, I think maybe the offense can be a bit better than we anticipate.
For sure. It's just a matter of, can he defend in this system, and is Buzz Williams willing to throw him out there for more than 20 to 22 minutes a game? If that's really hindering him, I think Buzz will be kind of hesitant.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. He's 6'5", 165, I think is what they list him at. So unless he's put on some weight this summer, because obviously I think that was his listed weight at his closing high school 247 profile, but we'll see maybe if he bulked up a little bit through the summer. Now looking at ceiling and floor for this Maryland team, obviously a much different looking roster compared to last year. Expected to finish much different than they did last year. Where do you have them falling?
I think they can get to 6th in the league. I still think it can be among the best defenses in this league, just because his teams have been so good on this end, and they bring a different element than most Big Ten teams bring. I mean, this is a really high pressure defense, probably, I don't know if it's the most athletic roster in this league. It might be, honestly, on the wings. I think they're going to really disrupt some teams in this league, and I think it could lead to them gaining some traction and getting to 6th in the league and being a 7 seed in the tournament. I think their floor is probably 12th in the league, maybe 13th. I just think the defense is going to, keep them away from the bottom. Obviously, we have some offensive concerns that could, ultimately drive them all the way out of the tournament. But I am pretty willing to bet that, a Buzz Williams team is going to hang around, at least on the bubble, for most of the year.
Yeah, I had a bit wider range of outcomes for this team. I said their ceiling could be 7th in this league. I just have some question marks around a bunch of the guys, around the efficiency, the creation on the offensive end. I said their floor could be down at 13th. So I think there's kind of in my opinion, a wider range of outcomes for this team, just for the reasons I mentioned, having some issues on the offensive end overall that could hold them back. So we'll see. And then did you have a bold prediction?
Yeah, I said some more of a stat line for El Payne. I had him averaging 14.5 points per game and 7.5, somewhere between 7.5 and 8 rebounds. I think, like you mentioned, I think he's going to have to play more than 20 minutes a game. I think he could get to that 26, 27 point per game mark, or minute per game mark. And I think that'll lead to a real boost in numbers. And I mentioned the extra usage that he probably ends up getting.
Right. Yeah. I went with a Pharrell Payne, not a stat, but just, a prediction here. I said he's going to make an all-conference team this year. Last year, not as much on his plate. This year, I think we're going to see a big jump in usage. And I think making an all-conference team, especially if Maryland is closer to the ceiling than the floor that we mentioned, he certainly is going to be in the mix there.
Yeah, that's fair. I think there's a lot of good players in this league, so it's going to be tough. It depends on if you're going off the 10-player first team or if you're going off 5-player. I think, right. I mean, I definitely think it's a possibility. He's a great two-way player.
Right. Yeah. So, all right. Well, we'll wrap things up here with the first rendition of Buzz Williams in Maryland, and we'll see you next time on the Mainly Hoops podcast.